Chapter 46. Portrait. Klein squatted there, vomiting involuntarily. He was soon done with his puking since he did not eat breakfast. At that moment, a tin-colored square flask that looked like a cigar box appeared in front of him. The mouth, which had lost its stopper, emitted a mixture of smells akin to tobacco, disinfectant, and mint leaves. It cleared up Klein's nose and rejuvenated him. The pungent smell continued to linger, but Klein no longer felt nauseous. He soon stopped vomiting. He traced the tiny flask up and saw a pale hand that did not seem to belong to a member of the living. He saw the mouth of a black trench coat sleeve and saw corpse collector Fry with his cold and dark bearing. "Thank you." Klein recovered completely, and with his hands on his knees, he stood back up. Fry nodded without any expression. "It'll be fine once you are used to it." He put back the flask stopper and put it into his pocket and turned around, walking to the highly decomposed corpse. Without gloves, he began examining the old woman. As for Dunn Smith and Leonard Mitchell, they paced slowly around the room, occasionally touching the table's surface or newspapers. Old Neil pinched his nose and stood outside the door, grumbling in a muffled voice, "Seriously gross. I'm going to request for additional pay this month." Dunn turned his head over and touched the wall beside the chimney with his gloved right hand. While doing so, he asked Klein, "Does this place look familiar?" Klein held his breath and constructed the silver pocket watch in his mind to calm down. With him already in his spirit vision state, he immediately felt different. A scene that came from the deepest recesses of his memories flashed past his eyes. Chimney, rocking chair, table, newspapers, the rusty nails on the door, the tin cans inlaid with silver. The scenes were dark and dull, like a documentary from Earth. However, it was even more blurry and illusory. The scene quickly stacked against what Klein was seeing. The feelings of déjà vu and having been here before presented themselves clearly. An illusory and ethereal scream seemed to pass through invisible walls. "Hornacis. Phlegria. Hornacis. Phlegria. Hornacis. Phlegria. It feels a little familiar." Klein answered honestly while his brain felt a stabbing pain. Thankfully, he quickly tapped his glabella twice. Hornacis. The Hornacis mountain range that appeared in original Klein's diary? That is content that was deciphered from the Antigonus family's notebook. The murmurs were very similar to one of the previous ones. It involved the word Hornacis. Is this a form of enticement? Klein was gripped by shock as he did not dare think deeper, afraid that he would place himself on the trajectory of losing control. Dunn nodded slightly and walked to a cupboard. He suddenly reached out his hand and pulled open its wooden door. The bread inside was moldy, and there were about 7 gray, stiff dead rats. "Leonard, go downstairs to get patrolling cops and explain the situation here," instructed Dunn. "All right." Leonard turned and left the apartment. Following that, Dunn opened the door to 2 other bedrooms and did a careful search. After being certain that there were no clues as well as any sign of the Antigonus family's notebook, Fry also stood up. He wiped his hands with a white handkerchief he brought along with him and said, "The time of death was more than 5 days ago. There are no external injuries, nor are there any clear signs that it was a result of beyonder powers. The exact cause of death will require a post-mortem. Did you discover anything?" Dunn turned to look at old Neil and Klein. The two who were no longer in spirit vision state shook their heads in unison. "Apart from the corpse, everything else is normal." Actually, no, there was an invisible energy sealing the apartment in the beginning. As you know, there will usually be similar processes when we use ritualistic magic. Old Neil thought for a few seconds before adding. Dunn was just about to say something when he looked outside the door. A few seconds later, Klein and old Neil sensed something and turned to look at the stairwell. A few seconds later, faint footsteps grew louder as Leonard walked up with a policeman. The policeman's expression changed once he caught the noxious smell. He immediately cooperated with his colleague from the Special Operations Department and began knocking on the doors of the residents on the 2nd floor to gain an understanding of the situation on the 3rd floor. Moments later, the corporal with his 2 silver chevrons looked at the corpse on the rocking chair. Katie Stephania Bieber, between 55 and 60 years old, widow, has rented this apartment with her son, Ray Bieber, for more than 10 years. Her husband was formerly a gem artisan. Her son is about 30 years old and is single. He inherited his father's trade and earns about £1 and 15 soldi a week. According to their neighbors, they have not seen them in more than a week. Before the policeman continued, Klein already knew the critical point that followed. Missing. To be more precise, it was unknown where Ray Bieber had gone to. The ancient notebook could very well be on him. Do you have a picture of Ray Bieber? Dunn looked at the police officer. He was acting as the role of a high-ranking inspector. However, it was not really acting since he was indeed a high-ranking inspector on the police department's roster. His salary and various allowances were also paid according to his rank. Of course, it did not include his salary from the church. The police officer shook his head nervously and said, "I'm not sure. I'll have to return to the station to search for it. It's not typical for us to have pictures of every single person." Got it. Continue questioning the residents on the first floor. Ask them in detail. Dunn gave the order. As he watched the police officer leave, he closed the door and turned to old Neil. "I'll leave the rest to you. If not, we will have to make all the residents sleep and obtain Ray Bieber's looks." "Yeah, I don't really trust sketches based on verbal descriptions." Old Neil nodded. He took out a few thumb-sized bottles from a pocket in his black classic robe and scattered the liquids in a particular order. Immediately following that, he pulled out a clump of powder and scattered it in a circle around him. Strangely, a biting smell spread and was not influenced by the nauseating smells in the room. Klein also suddenly noticed that there was an invisible force field around him. It separated him from the environment and everyone else. It was like the room in its previous state. Old Neil half closed his eyes as his lips mumbled a soft and indiscernible incantation. Without being prepared, Klein vaguely heard the words, "Goddess, give me strength. We look forward to the protection of the night." A sudden wind tore through the windows and blew up the powder. Klein's heart quaked suddenly as he felt goosebumps all over him. He found it difficult to describe. A terrifying smell that made him afraid of looking directly spread rapidly. He was confused as he tensed up, unable to relax. It felt as though he had plunged into a state similar to what one would have after working on a highly advanced mathematical problem. Suddenly, old Neil's eyes opened, his eyes pitch black. He took out a fountain pen from his pocket and began drawing on a piece of scrap paper on the table. He was so fast that his entire body was trembling. Klein focused his gaze and saw a face with recessed eyes and a tall nose bridge rapidly appear. When the natural curly short hair was done, old Neil wrote a single line beneath the portrait. Black hair, deep blue eyes. Left of his mouth is a fully ceramic tooth implant. Pata. The fountain pen in old Neil's hand fell onto the paper as his body convulsed a few times. "This is the image of Ray Bieber according to what's left in the room," old Neil whispered as the color of his eyes restored rapidly. Then, he turned back to his original spot and slowly circled it. The invisible force field that isolated things immediately dissipated in the form of a breeze. "Praise the lady." Old Neil tapped his chest in 4 spots, forming the shape of the crimson moon. Klein's taut nerves relaxed as he made more acute observations. He discovered that there was nothing special about Ray Bieber's facial features. He had a relatively mild bearing. The only thing was that his philtrum sagged clearly. "I'll try using dowsing rod seeking." He picked up the portrait and found male clothes in the bedroom and spread them onto the ground. Dunn, Leonard, and old Neil did not stop him as they watched him place the black cane above the clothes and portrait. Fry was as silent as always. Klein's eyes turned from brown to black as he finished his recitation, only to release his grip. The black cane stood silently like it was embedded in the ground. Ray Bieber's location. Klein silently repeated to himself again. With the sound of humming wind, the cane fell down but kept changing directions while falling. Finally, it began spinning in slight circles. Without any external help, the black cane stood stably again. Klein repeated a few times with the same outcome. All he could do was shake his head at Dunn and old Neil. A strange power was interfering with his divination. Dunn took off his black glove and said to Leonard and Klein, "Take Ray Bieber's portrait and inquire the residents for a final confirmation. Following that, we will issue a warrant of arrest against him for the murder of his mother." "All right." Klein held his cane and bent down to pick the portrait. After the neighbors confirmed that the portrait was indeed Ray Bieber, Dunn instructed Leonard and the police officer to finish the procedures at the station. He and Fry headed to a few bars in Tingen City to seek help via other means. Klein and old Neil returned to Blackthorn Security Company on a public carriage. It was not even 8 by the time they arrived. Roseanne had not even clocked in. After closing the door, Klein cocked his head at old Neil and, hoping to learn and answer his questions, asked him, "Why would I send the Antigonus family's notebook to Ray Bieber's home?" This was completely in a different direction from Iron Cross Street, where Welch stayed. Old Neil walked to the sofa and chuckled. "Isn't that obvious? Who knows what power's inside the notebook you invoked? Maybe you did some described ritual out of curiosity and ended up provoking a strange existence that you should not have. The motive of this existence was to have the notebook sent to Ray Bieber and sever all clues to prevent anyone from discovering it. Therefore, apart from you who were selected, Welch and Naya committed suicide. Regarding you, to be frank, I still have no idea how you survived. I would like to know too." Klein sat down as well as he deliberately replied with a wry smile. "I've also thought of the guesses you have of the proceedings. However, there's one thing I don't understand. Why did I have to hand the notebook to Ray Bieber?" Old Neil shrugged and said, "Perhaps his life path number 1 matches the requirements, or maybe he's one of the last remaining descendants of the Antigonus family. In short, there are too many possibilities. And why the notebook was sold to Tingen City would have similar reasons. I believe it's the descendant reason." Klein suddenly felt enlightened before he sighed. "Unfortunately, I did not discover immediately, and Ray Bieber and that notebook have vanished." Old Neil laughed. "This is something that Dunn has to worry about. As for you, it's something good." "Why do you say so?" Klein frowned in puzzlement. 1. A life path number was proposed by Pythagoras, which is established from the date of birth and describes the nature of one's journey through life. Chapter 47. Old Neil's Lack of Money. Old Neil rubbed his temples and said, "I believe we have a general idea of why the three of you engaged in a mass suicide. That notebook is also now purportedly in Ray Bieber's hands. Furthermore, the matter has already been exposed. Regardless of whether you are alive or dead, it will hardly influence any subsequent developments. I believe that the surreptitious existence or mysterious power that caused all of this will not pay you any special attention. It's just like how you would not pay attention to the ants on the ground. Haha, as long as you do not try to make him recall you. And our arrest warrant for Ray Bieber will quickly reach the secret order. They will also be able to guess that it is related to the Antigonus family's notebook. Believe me, for a secret organization that has been in existence for more than 1,000 years, it has many channels of information. Therefore, their focus will be diverted to Ray Bieber's whereabouts, in a bid to find the notebook before us. They will not, nor is it possible for them to harass, stalk, or deal with you. Lad, congratulations on stepping out from the shadows of the past. What follows will be a brand new journey filled with sunlight." Klein nodded when he heard that, as he said in a happy and relieved manner, "I hope so." Having transmigrated here, he had been enveloped in uncertainty. Now it felt like it had finally dissipated. However, Klein was still feeling uncertain because the notebook seemed to be tied to him in a certain manner. It went to the point of him bumping into remnant clues coincidentally from a normal mission of rescuing a hostage. He was afraid that there would come a day when a delivery man would send him a parcel, only to realize that it was that Antigonus family notebook after opening it up. Let's hope everything will go as old Neil described. He silently prayed. When old Neil heard his reply, he immediately scoffed. "You don't seem to be a devout believer of the goddess. At this moment, shouldn't you be drawing the sign of the crimson moon at your chest and say, 'May goddess bless us'?" "Mr. Neil, you don't seem like one either. A real devotee would not say what follows will be a brand new journey filled with sunlight." Having been studying mysticism under old Neil, Klein had established a decent friendship with him, so he did not stand on ceremony to return a sarcastic remark. Both of them locked eyes and chuckled with great rapport. At the same time, they tapped their chests 4 times. Praise the lady. At that moment, they heard the grinding sounds of machinery as the main door to Blackthorn Security Company opened. The elegant Mrs. Oriana with her fashionably coiled hair stepped into the reception hall with a light green dress. "Good morning, Mr. Neil." "Good morning, Klein." She held a small leather handbag as she greeted with a smile. "It's another fabulous day today. A pretty good day." "Good morning, Oriana. You are still as beautiful as 10 years ago," replied old Neil with a chuckle. Oriana's eyes turned to slits as she upturned her face. "Mr. Neil, the way you praise is still as infuriating as 10 years ago." She enunciated the words, 10 years. "Is that so?" Old Neil looked at Klein, confused. He wore a perplexed look. Never mention anything that will remind the ladies of their age. As a keyboard warrior that knew a little of everything, Klein instantly understood what had peeved Mrs. Oriana. He smiled lightly and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Oriana. You are as beautiful as always." "Thank you, our outstanding Koei University graduate." Oriana smiled with a nod before saying, "That old butler has already paid the mission's commission. According to Captain's rules, half of it will be used as additional funds, while the other half will be split between you and Leonard. But since you aren't a formal member, you can only take 10% of the half. Come over later to sign for it." "How much did he pay?" Klein asked happily while also feeling the pinch. £200. This was what he said back then. "Lord, the esteemed Storm. I never imagined or believed that this was resolved just like that. This is even harder than us having a dream. Why is your security company so unknown? It's an insult to the entire industry." Mrs. Oriana mimicked the old butler's southern accent. Klein thought seriously for a few seconds before saying humorously, "This is just too unfair for those kidnappers." Two Beyonders had resolved the problem quickly using methods that could be described as easy and pleasant. This is like an adult bullying a few kids while in full combat attire. They were just too unlucky. "They must have lost the protection of the divine," said Oriana with a soft laugh. "I told the butler that we were only lucky. One of our informants happened to see the kidnappers bring the child into the hideout. Therefore, do not have too much hopes for us. We really are just a very ordinary security company. Typically speaking, the more you emphasize something is ordinary, the more extraordinary it is." Klein lampooned with a smile. He watched Mrs. Oriana walk through the partition and enter the accounting room. Old Neil puckered his lips by the side and said enviously, "You really are a lucky lad. You haven't joined us for long and you've encountered a job worth £200. Is that very rare?" Klein asked in puzzlement. Prior to this, he was either studying history or mysticism or wandering aimlessly outside, hoping to find clues with his spiritual perception. According to Oriana's accounts, we might not encounter a single job an entire week, and most jobs are worth less than £20. Old Neil rubbed the moonstone by his wrist and sighed. Following that, he looked at Klein with anticipation. "If you encounter any similar jobs in the future, remember to inform me." Upon hearing Old Neil's words, Klein suddenly felt a strange feeling arise in him. Therefore, he asked directly, "Mr. Neil, you seem to be lacking in money. How much do you get paid a week? If you aren't comfortable telling me, just ignore my question." Old Neil leaned back into the sofa and chuckled. "This isn't something that needs hiding. I've been here for so many years. At present, I will obtain salaries from both the church and the police department every week, a total of £12. "A weekly salary of £12. Klein blurted out in surprise. A weekly salary of £12 with 52 weeks a year. That meant more than £600 a year. Back when he read the Tianjin Morning Post and Honest Paper, they had mentioned that high-profile lawyers only earned £800 to £1,000 a year. And those were the best lawyers. As for the managers of Benson's trading company, they only earned £6 a week. That was already quite a decent job. Yes, such a salary is actually quite generous, and we do not need to pay any taxes," added Old Neil with a smile. Klein had heard from Benson that one had to pay E-type taxes when their weekly salaries exceeded £1. In other words, the government and corporate employees had to pay 3% of taxes if they earned £1 to £2, 5% for £2 to £5, 10% for £5 to £10, and 15% for £10 to £20, capping at 20% for those above £20. Other than that, he also read of 4 other kinds of taxes on the newspapers. A-type was related to land, housing, and other earnings from material items. It included property and rent. B-type was a tax paid by farmers. C-type was a tax on profits from bonds, funds, and equities. D-type was commercial, finance, or professional income. "It's something admirable," Klein echoed Old Neil. However, Old Neil shook his head. "Such a salary is insufficient for Beyonders like us who have to frequently study the hidden mysteries, practice, and attempt rituals." "Aren't materials obtainable via application?" asked Klein in puzzlement. Old Neil scoffed. "There's a limitation to it. At times, we have to give a sufficient legitimate reason. If you want to learn more and experiment in the field of mysticism, You can only spend your own dime to buy materials. It can be bought internally or at underground markets. Klein jolted in surprise as he immediately asked, "There are beyonder materials that are sold in underground markets? I thought the churches would not permit their existence." He was lacking in means to obtain materials. With him having a mysterious organization in its nascent stages, he could not always have them settled via the Nighthawks, right? There's no way to control such matters. Yeah, from the viewpoint of mysticism, all beings are sentient with their spirits, and they stem from the same source. The materials we use are not limited to those extraordinary creatures. It also comes from ordinary animals, plants, and minerals. For example, the poison hemlock, gold mint leaves, and night vanilla in the bottle of seer potion. They are items we can encounter frequently in our daily lives. They might not have any extraordinary characteristics, but they have special characteristics. Through concoction and blending, they will derive certain effects. Therefore, this is not a trade that the church can ban, explained old Neil in detail. Without waiting for Klein to say a word, he continued, "Besides, it's not only the core of extraordinary beings that are of use. For example, the Lavos squid. Apart from its blood, its eyeballs, skin, and tentacles are pretty good materials. Unless the church captures it entirely with its own manpower, to completely corner and control any outflows would be a tremendous financial burden. The lower the grade of the extraordinary material, the more it is so. They can only do their best to prevent the more special materials from flowing out." Old Neil suddenly laughed. "There's another important reason. It's better to know of an underground market than not knowing of it. Under the premise that secret organizations have not been fully eliminated, this is a pretty good strategy. Besides, it can help us obtain materials we are lacking. Of course, with the existence of such markets, contraband items will appear. As long as it's not something ridiculous or overly dangerous, we will turn a blind eye to it. At most, we would use them to enrich our vaults. Is it because the few large churches put each other in place, so no one can take excessive action?" Klein guessed. Old Neil acknowledged tersely but did not elaborate. "I'm a seer. In the future, I'll definitely need to practice and will need more materials. Mr. Neil, can you take me to the underground market to have a look?" Klein requested with a valid reason. Old Neil appeared to be placed in a difficult position. In fact, those guys who are active in those places are mostly not beyonders. Some of them might be aristocrats that like mystery or rich people who have inclinations towards mysticism. All right. I have a 30-pound bill that needs paying soon. It wouldn't be convenient for me to head over there for the time being. All right. Klein never expected the reason to be old Neil's owing of money. Moments later, he said with deliberation, "Mr. Neil, do you need me to lend you money? I just earned a commission of 10 pounds. Haha, there's no need. I'll be able to settle it." Old Neil patted the sofa and slowly stood up. "Sigh. Age is truly an enemy that biological creatures can't fight. I'm exhausted from last night's watch. Yeah, revise what I've taught you later this morning. Read more documents. Tomorrow, I'll teach you the foundations of ritualistic magic." All right. Klein got up and bade him farewell by taking off his hat. When Captain Dunn did not return at noon, Klein pretended that he was still searching for the notebook as he roamed the streets again. Having earned 10 pounds, he no longer needed to wait for the next disbursement of the funds. He could head directly to the divination club. Cogitation and spirit vision have been occasionally producing murmurings and illusions. It made him eager to begin acting. Chapter 48. Hannes Vincent. In the divination club situated at the second floor of 13, House Street, North Borough of Tingen City, Klein saw the beautiful lady that attended to visitors once again. She was still having her brownish-yellow long hair coiled, making her look mature and elegant. It was hard to tell her age. "Hello, Mr. Glassy isn't here today. Would you like to change fortune tellers today?" said the beautiful lady with a smile. Upon hearing that, Klein, who had just taken off his silk hat and put it back on, was immediately surprised. "You still remember me? That was already 5 days ago." The woman puckered her lips into a smile. "You are the first customer that sought Mr. Glassy's services. You are also the only one to this very day. It's hard for me not to have a deep impression of you." Was this the image of him being penny-wise, pound-foolish? Klein lampooned himself as he deliberated a question. When was the last time Mr. Glassy came to the club? The lady shot a glance at him and answered seemingly in recollection. "To be honest, We are unable to grasp when our members will come and go. They have their free will and personal matters to tend to. Well, I do believe that Mr. Glassy hasn't come to the club since he told your fortune that day. I wish him the best of luck. May the goddess bless him. Klein prayed and did not ask further. Instead, he asked with a smile, I'm not here for divination services this time. I plan to join the club. Really? That's our pleasure. The lady expressed a timely look of surprised delight. For the first year as a member, the membership fee is £5. It will be £1 a year thereafter. I believe there's no need for me to describe in the details again. Klein took out a £5 note he recently received as he watched Henry Augustus I's portrait depart him. After seriously checking the anti-counterfeit watermark, the woman stored away the note seriously and handed a form to Klein. Please fill in your detailed information. Let me prepare the receipt for you. There's a receipt? You should bill it to Blackthorn Security Company. Klein was amused by his own thoughts as he picked up a fountain pen on the desk. With the blackish blue ink, he filled in his name, age, address, and company information. However, he had deliberately left his date of birth empty. To a seer, that provided profound mysteries about his body through his life path number. After receiving the receipt and finishing his registration as a member, the lady extended her right hand. Congratulations on joining Tingen City's Divination Club. I'm Angelica Barhart, your hard-working server. This is your member cufflinks. There are special inscriptions on them which will identify you as a member. Hello, Madam Angelica. Klein shook her hand and took the dark gold cufflinks. He realized that the special inscription was written with the root word for fortune teller in Hermes. Angelica retracted her right hand and thought for a few seconds. Might I ask what divination arts you are most familiar with? Or would you prefer to learn some divination methods from the club? We will consider inviting famous fortune tellers of the corresponding domain to give classes. We will also introduce you members with similar expertise so that you can have a good time interacting with them. I know a bit of every divination art. There's no need to give me any special considerations. Klein replied with some embellishments. In addition, he inquired, can I begin telling the fortunes of others? I'm not a total rookie. He was here to act as a seer and not learn the divination methods ordinary people could learn. Angelica maintained a polite smile as she said, you can tell the fortunes of people anytime in the club. However, before we confirm your skills, we will not promote you when our customers ask. How much do you plan on charging for your fortune telling? 2 pence. Klein decided to gain an advantage with price while he was still unknown. We will go by the standard of taking an eighth, so we will be taking a quarter pence for fees. Angelica repeated the various rules first before writing Klein's information into the fortune teller album, which customers could choose from. After all of this was done, she pointed at the meeting room at the far end of the corridor with a smile. Mr. Hannas Vincent is currently explaining astrolabe divination. You can find a quiet spot to listen in. You can also raise your questions if there are any queries. All right. Klein walked toward the meeting room with his interest piqued. He wanted to know the differences between what Hannas Vincent and Old Neil said. At that moment, Angelica chased up and whispered, Mr. Moretti, would you want coffee or tea? We provide Side Black Tea, Southville Coffee, and Desi Coffee. Klein, who had been reading the papers regularly, knew that these coffees and black tea were considered as one of the inferior varieties, but he also knew that they were definitely of better quality than the ones he had at home. After some thought, he said, a cup of Southville coffee. 3 teaspoons of sugar without milk, please. Lone Kingdom's Southville was famous for its beer and red wine. Many important figures were fond of them. However, their coffee was relatively unknown. All right, I'll send it to you in a bit. Angelica pointed towards the meeting room. Klein slowly walked to the half-closed door and heard a voice in a thick Awa accent explaining. Astrolabe divination is a relatively more complex one among the divination arts. But that's only for ordinary people. Klein silently tagged on a sentence for the speaker. He saw about 5 tables placed in a circle inside the meeting room. It surrounded a middle-aged man in a black classic robe, Hannas Vincent. The gentleman had obvious dark circles. His brown hair was thick and hard. Each strand stood firmly like a porcupine's spikes. Apart from that, there was nothing unique about him. Upon seeing Klein enter, Hannas Vincent nodded gently without stopping his class. He only slowed down his speech. Klein had one hand in his pocket while the other held his cane. He found a seat to the sides and sat down, leaning back comfortably in the process. He scanned the circle of 6 members. There were 4 men and 2 women. Some of them were attentively taking notes, whispering, or returning Klein a rueful smile. After placing his cane down, Klein adjusted his half-top hat and tapped his glabella twice in the process. He cast his gaze at Hanas and saw the different colors, brightness, and thickness of his aura. Dark red. He's a little worried. Actually, every other part of his body is healthy except that part. I wonder what's wrong. Klein listened to the class while muttering to himself. At that moment, he clasped his right hand and covered his mouth to prevent his laughter from sounding. He suddenly felt like he was a quack. He was rather pleased with his spirit vision ability. Although he could only make a general judgment and not the details, it was enough to gain him much useful information. After surveying his surroundings, he tapped his glabella twice again, as though he was pondering over what Hanas had just said. Astrolabe divination was one of the astromancy divination methods. However, ordinary people could also attempt to interpret things. For instance, the most basic birth horoscope was to determine the inquirer's fate by determining the positions of the sun, moon, blue planet, and scarlet planet at their birth, the corresponding spots in the sky, matching the representative symbols to the astrolabe, and the corresponding situations of the different constellations. This required the fortune teller to be able to calculate the states of the planets and constellations, which was rather complicated. Of course, there were publications that aided people to look up the values. Some even simplified it by making a vague read with just the constellations. Klein listened silently without interjecting or asking any questions. From time to time, he would caress the hanging topaz at his sleeve or take a sip of the Southville coffee which Angelica had brought in. After some time, Hanas rubbed his glabella and said, "Perhaps you will need to attempt at creating your own astrolabe. Ask me if you have any questions. I will be in Moonstone." After he left, a young man in a white shirt and black vest got up with a smile and walked to Klein's side. "Nice to meet you. I'm Edward Steve." "My pleasure. I'm Klein Moretti." Klein stood up and returned the bow. "Astrolabes are too complicated. Every time I hear about it, I can't help but doze off," said Edward self-deprecatingly. Klein grinned and said, "That's because Mr. Vincent can't help but pass the knowledge he grasps to us. It's like giving us an Intis feast. It's just indigestible. I'd be able to finish the Intis feast. They usually use a huge plate to serve tiny bits of food." Edward chuckled and sat up. He asked out of curiosity, "Are you new? I've not seen you in the 2 years I was here." "I just joined the club today," answered Klein frankly. "What are you good at?" "I'm best at tarot and poker divination." Edward casually asked. "I know a little of everything, but just a little." Klein gave a description he used to give himself. He was not being modest since there was just too much mysterious knowledge he had not grasped in the domain of divination. Just as the other members were thinking of talking about horoscope divination, Angelica walked into the meeting room. "Mr. Steve, someone wants you to tell their fortunes." "All right." Edward stood up with a smile. "I can tell you are an excellent fortune teller," said Klein as he looked at him. "No, it's because my price is most suitable," said Edward with a soft chortle. "When ordinary people come to have their fortunes told, they will absolutely not choose the most expensive ones. And unless they had their heads kicked by asses, they would definitely not be choosing the cheapest few. It's easiest to gain opportunities if you are in the middle. I'm one of those that had their heads kicked by asses." When he saw Edward leave, Klein suddenly shook his head with a wry smile. "It seems the price I set is problematic." He stood up, picked up his cane, and left the meeting room. He found Angelica again. "I wish to change the prices of my divination." Set it to 8 pence." Angelica took a deep look at him and said, "We will satisfy your request, but we will also tell customers that you only recently joined the club." "No problem." Klein did not mind as he nodded. At times, mystery was also an important element for a seer to attract customers. After changing his details, Klein returned to the meeting room. At that moment, he saw Hanas Vincent walk out of Moonstone. He held a silver-coated mirror. This well-known fortune teller said to the 5 members in the meeting room, "I recently learned a new divination art. Magic mirror divination. Does anyone want to learn? Magic mirror divination? That's not safe." Klein paused outside the meeting room and frowned.